it's better to be on their knees now than much later when they are on their knees before a judge. So let's hang it here. I want to hear from the panelists. Let's start with Dr. Bain. I'd like him to give us a little idea about himself, particularly transitioning from being a single man to a father. What were some of the thoughts that were going through his mind as the reality of I'm a daddy? How did that hit you? Following him, we hear from Jide answering the same question.
Well, good morning to everyone. I got married at age 25, 3 weeks after graduating from the medical school at UWI. When I came to Jamaica, I had no plans to stay in Jamaica. I thought I would spend 5 years in school and then leave. But God had other plans for me. And one part of that plan was to introduce me to the person who was going to be my wife. When we got married, we were hoping that we would have children, but I did not know for sure. And I don't know if anybody knows for sure if we're going to have children. So in the early I didn't think about parenting as such. But when my wife became pregnant with our first child, I had some decisions to make right away. And one of those decisions was how I would focus on becoming a father while being a student still, because after I did my first set of training, I joined the postgraduate program at the university. And I knew that I would have to spend some time in that program. Part of the challenge for me was that I played a lot of football. I played for the Ministry of Health. I had played for the university. And I had to make a decision how I would balance my life. And I made a hard decision, hard for me, to give up competitive football as I prepared to be a parent. So that's a part of my answer to that question.
Good, very good. Jide, was yours as dramatic?
Can share my because of the whole. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Yeah, so I think for me, the transition was similar, but a lot more happened before we got married. So Claire was 1 year ahead of me at university. So she was leaving university before I was doing my finals, which meant I needed to get my act together quickly, right? Because of course you no longer have the privilege of seeing the person on campus and being around. So you now need to say what your intentions are, right? And so we started talking, I think, seriously, courting around that time, just to say, we have an interest. We think there's something here. We want to explore it. And then the discussions morphed very quickly into, well, what are your plans after graduating? And I was very strong about her doing her master's and me doing my master's before marriage. That was ingrained in my head. So it meant a lot of coordinating. And then it also meant, if we're serious about this, getting counseling. Now, it's counseling that I think is really the answer to your question. I think in counseling, it helped me visualize what it meant to be married. And being married would not only be about, hugging my wife and waking up in the morning and seeing her, there are other questions that you'd have to think about. Questions as to, how many children you may want, questions as to whether or not you want to have children, because not all couples want to, and not all parts of a union may have the same view as to that. So a lot of those foundational conversations I thought were really good. But one of the classic conversations I remember having with Sister Damdar, as I was thinking about marriage, she asked a question. She says, "Do you know what you're getting into?" No, I had no idea what I was getting into. And I think, your daughter said it, nothing quite prepares you for parenting. Nothing. I mean, you read the books, you have the conversations, but the reality of it. But I think as much advice as you can get before while you're courting, being on the same page with your partner about expectations, values, the better. It makes the journey that much easier when you hit the ground and you have a live situation. So that's my response.
May I say something more? When my wife, wasn't my wife yet, my fiance went to her pastor and introduced me to him. He, with a big, broad smile on his face, said, "Congratulations, and I want to give you a book." It was a book about how to do the wedding. He said nothing about the marriage, nor any of the leaders here said anything to me about the marriage. In those days, there were no counselors. Jide mentioned counseling. We did not have counseling. We had in-service education in family. And thankfully, both of us had been readers of the scriptures and of books written by Christian authors. And those books help us in our preparation for marriage. And what I found as we move forward was that there were surprises. For example, the song that we love to sing, "With Christ in the Vessel," there, "You Can Smile at the Storm." Persons here have heard me say this before, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself for some, but I didn't realize that there were storms in the vessel as well. And I had to learn that, and my wife had to learn how to deal with storms in the vessel as well as storms on the sea.
One of the terms we've used here within recent days to describe your role as fathers is the role family shepherds. The biblical image of a shepherd caring for his flock is one standing long hours, watching over its safety, leading it to fresh pasture, carrying the weak, seeking the lost, healing the wounded and the sick. From this biblical understanding of shepherding, the term family shepherds has emerged. The family shepherd is a man who acknowledges his role to provide spiritual leadership in his home. His leadership is characterized by intimacy, tenderness, skill, hard work, and love. Assuming that you agree with this characterization of a family shepherd, what is your understanding of your role as a leader in your home? Jide, why don't you head off with this one?
All right, no problem. So I think for me, the passage in Ephesians 5, where they speak about the relationship between the husband and wife and the role of the husband as loving his wife as Christ loved the church, has always resonated with me. Christ is the good shepherd, right? And you cannot love more than to lay down your life for those that are under your care. And so for me, the loving supporting, providing, caring for one's family is a natural expression of one's journey with his own shepherd. I don't see them as distinct things. I see them as expressions of that first relationship. And I think if anything you do as a husband comes from any other source, it is going to end up being frustrated. It's going to be non-genuine. It's going to be forced.
For example?
So, for example, there are other motivations for playing out the role of father. For example, it can be to stoke one's own ego. You know, my way or the highway, I know better, etc., etc. The other motivation could be, for example, as a sort of a trophy. So, you know, here it is, have a wife, have kids, you know,
yes,
and let's move on to something else.
Yes.
You know, and I could give a couple other types of approaches.
Yes, Dr. Bain, on this, in terms of understanding your role as a leader, spiritual leader in your home.
When I listen to that description that you read out, I think that it sounds very perfect. And if I try to relate it to my journey, thinking about starting off, choosing to be a husband, because I knew that that was a deliberate choice. And then when God blessed us with 1, 2, 3 children, which we have, recognizing that I had the responsibility to relate to them in a number of practical ways. But I must say that the example of the older generation was something that affected me. I only knew one of my grandfathers, and he was a little number was that he made a pair of shoes for me when I was coming up to Jamaica. And I treasured that for a number of years. But he never talked with me about his relationship with the Lord. I saw him go to church, but we never had a one-on-one conversation that I can remember. My father grew up in a Catholic setting with foster parents because his mother had died when he was an infant and his father had migrated to Venezuela. He was a provider, but he never spoke love. He demonstrated it, but he was a quiet man as a father. Once or twice in all the years of my growing up, he disciplined me with his hand. One stroke of the palm was enough. And I had that picture subconsciously, even as a committed Christian coming into marriage. So when you give that very detailed discussion of a family shepherd, I don't know if I had that as a pattern in my mind to, you know, that I would become that, you know. So that's what I'm saying at this point.
Yes, go ahead.
Just as a follow-up as well, I think it's important that you also let your wife and your children know that you're human. And I remember there's one conversation before we got married. I told my wife, I have a temper. And she says, no, you don't. And I say, yes, I do. I just know she don't. I've never seen it. I said, yes, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And, you know, again, through marriage, if I were to say it, she would still say, Jide, you don't have a temper. But I know I have a temper. And I know that's something that I work out with the Lord. And I've asked her to join me on that journey and keep me accountable to him for how I manage it.
Good.
So what I'm trying to say is it's important that your partner and your children also see you as human.
Yes.
Because if you try to be perfect, you end up putting on a facade.
Yes.
And they cannot travel with you on that journey.
But they also learn how you correct errors in your life.
Absolutely.
And that's part of the journey too.
That's a very, very important. In fact, it is the journey.
Yes.
So when I say it is the journey, you're always in this, the shepherd you're following is perfect.
Yes.
And you are following him, which means that you're changing. And you're adjusting as your understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ evolves. And they need to come with you on that journey.
Good.
It's not something you go off and do and then come back to them and say, hey, here are the 10 commandments, you know, so just to make that point.
Yes.
But you know, when I think about the persons represented in our congregation, and we use the word family, the family forms even in a small congregation like ours are very different. Yes. I am thinking about two people who have been my friends on the journey for many years. I'm thinking about Mr. Douglas Cover and his wife, Judy. Mm-hmm. If we were having an interview with them about fathering, they have no children of their own. Mm-hmm. How would we encourage them with respect to family? They have done a lot for many persons, as I have watched from my distance. They've brought people in their home. They have mentored persons who are now married. They have shown hospitality to a wide range of persons. And that's a blessing to me. And I'm sure that many people could echo that. God chose not to give them children of their own, biological children. But that doesn't disqualify them from family.
They have the hearts of parents. And this they have successfully demonstrated in a number of ways, as you say, mentoring and being there for people even before marriage. As people learn, in my own case, we learned as we went from door to door, having a meal with someone, meeting a different family, we found ourselves discussing what we witnessed. And so they didn't set themselves up as models. And this applies to others too who do not have children. But people see you as models. You don't make yourself a model. And today their names can be mentioned because they've modeled godly parenting before us. That brings me into the next question. As a church, Mona Heights Chapel seeks to provide nurturing for everyone, from the cradle to the grave. Does this role of the church replace your role as a family shepherd in your home? Who wants to go first to that?
I'll go first. Clearly, no. But you know, I have heard discussions over the years, and God knows what is right. And even our teachers over the years have not helped me to make the decision about the order of priority. God first. There's no disagreement about that. Some of our teachers have said church second and family third. Mm-hmm. And others have said family second and church third. Now, I don't know if there's a first, second, and third. I think that there's a balance that God asks us to aim for as his obedient children. And depending on a person's place in their family, you know, there are some sibling families, parents have died, and they are continuing as family. They have responsibilities at home. And sometimes we define church as this building. So when people say church second, sometimes they think that they have 100% attendance record at the activities that are organized here is of paramount importance. Of family, you know, so sometimes people sacrifice family. attendance at church if they define church in that sort of way. I think that we need to be talking to each other and encouraging each other in the word and follow the word rather than, you know, when you're a teacher, you have a huge responsibility, you know, because if any of us guide somebody on the wrong path, then we share the responsibility.
Yes.
So it's something that I think requires ongoing discussion and to know how
But
to
in
make
essence,
the
though,
balance.
you do not see the church replacing you from being a family shepherd.
No,
Okay.
no.
Let's hear Jide on this.
So I have a story.
Yes.
So when our kids were young, we were more in the New Kingston area. We went to Swallowfield. And of course, as young parents, you want your children to get exposure to the word and church and, you know, and they're small, you know, so we're talking about like 1 year old, right? So just to let you know, right? For context, so you have the picture. So one would have been 1.5. Well, Gianna, you're about a couple months older than Sunny. Right? All right, so I won't guess the ages. Anyway, so we took them to Sunday school. And eventually what happened is we wanted to leave them in Sunday school, but they didn't want us to leave. So we stayed. And as we stayed in the Sunday school class, we decided to help. And as we helped, we observed some things and we saw some cases. I saw some cases where children were bringing their parents to Christ. Let me be more specific. Children were bringing their parents to church. And because the parents were in the Sunday school class setting, they were hearing the word. So when we're answering a question like this, there's no right or wrong answer to it. Depends on the state of spiritual maturity, even spiritual state. Because if the person is not a believer, it could very well be that it's the child through church that is influencing the parent. One would hope that over time that dynamic would change.
Yes.
But the answer certainly is, you know, what you want is for the bedrock of the person's spiritual development to be what is happening at home, because that is where the person exists.
That's
most
true.
of the time. Church is Sunday, Wednesday. Maybe you go to prayer meeting. Those are just the peripheral
And
moments.
those services are not geared to the child specifically. But if we look at the Sunday school hour, if we look at the Vacation Bible School, we look at camps, we look at those other ministries. When you count up the amount of hours you're talking about, they are so few compared to the time that parents have to be able to influence their children. And I asked this question intentionally because up to the north, you know, we learned so much about them from America, but I want to caution us as to what we learn, because there are some churches that feel, some parents that feel, I will decide on the church depending on what you do for my child. And they see the church as the place where the child receives his or her spiritual education or Christian education. There has to be a partnership in this process, but the responsibility of the shepherd is at home, primarily at home. And how you can combine them, I can see the family shepherd asking a child, for instance, what did you learn in Sunday school today? And the conversation continues in the home. And so there is a sense in which there ought to be that relationship, but never an abandonment of family shepherding in preference for what the Sunday school teaches or others can do.
Here's a comment. We heard our brother Kevin last Sunday start his message by saying parenting is difficult. Parenting is hard. And when we think about today's parent, okay, before COVID, a lot of parents, the children were leaving home very early in the morning. The child would be going off to school, depending on the child's age. And the parent would have to battle traffic in the afternoon to get back home. And the question of preparing for parenting, planning, and actually carrying out parenting in some circumstances is very hard. But the commitment that each of us who is a parent should have should be very, very definite, you know, and that is what can help. But the hours that you spend are often curtailed by the job that you do.
Very much so, yeah.
Outside of,
Yes.
you know, even outside of church.
And sometimes the demands of the job continue at home. And so we have to watch that. But it brings us to another question on the matter of Christian education programs at home, including devotions, intentional programs at home to educate our children. I know it's an ongoing thing in terms of the example we set, but I'm talking about specific times, either for scripture memorization, for reading passages. How have you handled this in your respective families?
With a lot of trial and error and a lot of gaps.
Yes.
You know, because mornings years ago were different. And, you know, when I was doing my specialist training here, then we spent 2 years in England. I had to get up early and go out to the hospital and come back home after dark. And in winter, dark came early. But we knew that we wanted to share the word with our children. We tried to ensure that there were conversations and there was a focus on the word, but I can't say that we had devotions every single day.
Okay. How have you handled it? Your family is much younger.
So I would break it up into 3 stages. There was the early childhood stage before they were Christians. There was the early childhood stage when they became believers. And then there was the high school stage, which is where they are now. So just so that you're clear.
Yes.
So it was a lot more, when they were younger, a lot more directed in terms of making sure they were watching the right videos, which had high Christian content, praying with them, you know, at the lunch table before you eat, so that, you know, they see that prayer is an important part of one's routine and habit and what is normal. Facilitating times of fellowship with other members of the family, as well as friends who are believers, so they could see how this Christian thing would really work. When they both made a commitment to Christ at different times, it became more about helping them to develop their own Christian habits. The kind of music that they listen to, reading the scriptures for themselves, praying for themselves, and a lot less of us almost being outwardly setting out a curriculum for them,
Yes,
as it were, right?
Yes, yeah.
And then certainly as they moved to high school, it's been a lot more about just finding out, how are things going? You know, what are you reading? What are you learning? Do you have questions? And having the conversations around that. And them initiating. So they may initiate times of prayer, which is very different from earlier on.
Yes, yes.
So if there may be a situation at the house, and they may initiate prayer as a way to address that situation.
Yes.
Or perhaps we're going to go off on a trip just out of town. They may initiate praying before we leave.
Now, do you find yourself also inviting them either to pray for a meal or to pray for a situation, and now that they are maturing in their faith?
Good. So myself and Cleo are very different. Cleo would more, my wife, everybody should know Cleo. Cleo will more ask for them to participate in different ways. I am more wanting to see them
take the initiative.
And they figured this out. They figured this out a long time ago.
I'm sure they're driving home with you today, so be careful.
I want to make a comment from a different angle. You used the phrase Christian education. I think that our families, if we are healthy, and that's a tricky word that I'm using, because there are different degrees of health and strength in family. But you know, it's not just about in our house, but a wall around it and a gate and so on. It's about friends and other families that can influence Christian education
Yes.
or life, approach to life. And these days, in addition to people, there's this kind of instrument.
Yes.
And this is something that parents need to be very aware of. And the matter of guiding our children and sometimes deciding at what age they can be trusted to use this kind of instrument.
Now that leads me to a question that I did not have planned. It has to do with the transition, allowing your children the freedom to have access to the internet or social media or things like that. That's a very real challenge children are facing, particularly in younger families. Could you answer that one, Jide? How have you helped your children to navigate the internet?
I thank God for my wife. So that's my response. Cleo is very tech savvy, communication savvy, and has played a very hands-on role in facilitating Jan and Senny's journey into the digital space with parental controls on devices, with discussions about content that they may or may not be seeing. And that was certainly, I would say, as they got older, meaning 6 to 10, that phase where they have all the physical and intellectual knowledge about how to use the devices. And for the kids now, it's like from 3, right? They know how to do these things really early, and that Cleo played a very important. I was a lot less active in that space.
Yes.
But Cleo and I discussed it, so we certainly had an agreement as to what was normal. But can I tell you, beyond that, I think in this era, it is more important to teach your children how to fish than it is to give them fish. Yeah. So it is a lot more important to, rather than to say, here is a program you need to watch, it's more important to say why a particular program is unhealthy for you. Because ultimately speaking, you cannot control all the conduits through which they can get information.
Right.
When I grew up, if you want to see something that was filthy, you had to go physically from your house to a store and go into an aisle.
In other words, they couldn't find that material in your house.
No.
Right.
That is not the reality that our children are born into. Anybody from 2000 onwards has not been born into that reality. So yes, the parental controls are extremely important on devices and so on, but ultimately speaking, you have to invest in their understanding of why something is not healthy and why other things are healthy. That being embedded in their brains from an early age is priceless.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a story. The girls, and I didn't get their permission, but when they went into high school, we had trouble dropping them and picking them up from school because of our working hours and the school hours. So we organized for a school bus to take them to and fro school. It took us a year to realize that on the school bus, there were non-Christians. And the non-Christians who were on the school bus spoke words which we do not speak in our house. Now, in a situation like that, what you're relying on is your child's understanding of what is appropriate.
Yes.
And your child's understanding of the principle that because everybody else is doing it, doesn't mean it's okay for me to do it.
Right.
So it was a blessing to discover around Christmas time when we gave the driver a little tip for him to tell us that, your children are so different. And we said, how? And then we discovered why they were so different.
Yes.
And I'm giving that story not to tell tales out of turn, but it's to make the point that you cannot secure your child's eardrums or eyes or feet indefinitely. At some point, they have to own.
Something else you've raised that's very important. You kept the communication channels open with your children so that they could always feel free to discuss with you what they were learning. Now, the question I want to put to Dr. Bain is not so much about the internet, but preparing your children for career choices. How did you help your children to make those kinds of decisions?
Not very well. If I could understand what my wife and my attitude were, we did not think that we needed to channel our children in any particular direction. Many people have asked me, so none of your children have become medical doctors? And that's true. None of them has become a medical doctor because it wasn't my goal to, coach them to become medical doctors. They have had the opportunity to choose their own careers. We have always encouraged them to commit their decisions to God, to pray for his guidance. And I think that that's all that we have done. There have been times when they have come in specific situations and said, here's an opportunity that seems to be coming up. What do you think? So, and we have once or twice had to say, there's something a bit shady about that. There's some tricky things about that. If I were you, I would probably give up that particular opportunity. But the times when they were choosing were after they got into university education, which was something that was a privilege for my family because I was the first person in my generation to go to university. And then I became a teacher at the university with privileges so that there'd be discounts for the children to study. And that's how they got to university. And then, so they did well enough in high school and they got places in university. It was after that that they had to make some decisions about career choices. And they were mature enough to consider how, and they were sufficiently grounded in my opinion and my wife's opinion.
But I'd like to suggest though, both yourself and your wife may not have succeeded or did not pursue or encourage them to pursue your career paths. But I'd like to suggest, and I say this for myself and for a number of other families, yet you influenced your children in that you brought to the table a level of compassion from your profession, as well as your wife as a counselor brought a level of compassion for people in her profession. And I'm confident as you look at your children today, one is an IT specialist, still shows that compassion as he deals with clients. One as a pastor who shows that compassion as he deals with his congregants. And even your daughter in England, she did not choose what you would call the most lucrative path, but made choices where she could relate to people and show compassion. Would you agree with that analysis?
As I frame my response, I'm thinking about the persons in the congregation and persons on Zoom, because we represent a whole variety of backgrounds and experiences. And what I hear in your question that I can agree with is that we do model for our children.
Yes.
Even when we don't think we're modeling.
That's correct.
We model. And so it's not just the genes. It's not just the DNA. I think it's the environment. And I want to encourage every parent, every grandparent to recognize that you set an example and your children can choose.
Yes.
And they may follow your example closely or not so closely, but in principle, They are watching you, they're learning from you.
Mhm.
And as Jide said earlier on in the conversation, you can't pretend, you can't put it on
Right.
because they know you
Right.
on the inside better than
And
even
yes.
persons on the outside.
All right, I have two last questions for you. Yeah.
One small comment that Jesus didn't become a carpenter.
Yes. Go ahead.
That's just a comment. I mean, he didn't follow it, so
Yeah, but
I think
he used that
think
knowledge though still.
no, he did. I'm
Yes.
being tongue in cheek. But I'm just saying that the objective, I think, as a parent, and I can only speak conceptually because I'm still on that journey, which is why I avoided the question. Jen and Sandy, we talk after church. But just to say that I think it's more about the character, or is it the character that you develop in your child as they discover where their passions are, their discovery, and that's their journey. And I think Joseph did a great job in that respect. His son didn't want to follow in the family trade, right? And yet still he was born for a purpose.
Yes.
And so can you imagine if he was insisted that no, this boy needs to be a carpenter? I'm being obviously tongue in cheek.
You're onto something very positive, because again, I see when you look at the ministry of Jesus and you find him, for instance, saying, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The concept of a yoke being easy has a lot to do with what the carpenter has done in preparing that yoke, so it does not become an irritant on the back of the animal that's carrying the yoke. So he used his knowledge and his experience in the profession in terms of making a point in his ministry.
Quick point that we have grown up in a certain time, in a certain age of democracy and an age of opportunity. So my father used to tell me many times, boy, if I had the opportunities that you are having now, I would have done so and so. And I can say the same thing. I've never drilled that into my children or grandchildren, but I know that the opportunities that have opened up for them in Jamaica are different from 50 years ago. And
very much
so the choices they have are based partly on opportunities.
Right, good. Two quick questions coming to the end now. This question has to do with the reality in Jamaica. It's likely that there are more single mothers listening to this conversation than what we may call the families, like our families. How does a single mother play a role of a family shepherd?
I think that that's a very important question. I think that the circumstances that have led to single families are quite diverse, and each of us as a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, must know who we are, where we are, what we are called to do, and what opportunities there may be for strengthening the approach to parenting. Some people are choosing to foster children now, and they need guidance in fostering. But single women who have children need to look for trustworthy supports that can help them to work with their children. And it's not something that you can just create. I mean, you don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to do this, but it's something you can think about. And I think that the church as a company needs to be sensitive to persons to the extent that they are willing to open up and, request the help and support. Because we can't just come and sit down together and ignore the circumstances of life for person A, person B.
I'm very glad you touched on that, because there are hosts of ideas that can emerge. I know of churches, for instance, that provide babysitters so that parents can have a night off, not just a couple, but even a single parent. That's something that can happen. where there isn't aren't immediate family members like nephews and uncles and brothers and different ones that can provide the support. The church can intentionally look for such opportunities. How would you respond to that question, though?
I think the response was very good. It's to reach out to your network and to see who are the persons that are there that can play a role in your child's life. I think about this specifically for boy children, because even as in my own experience, particularly as you go from 8, 9, 10 and up, it's really important that you have a male figure that you can relate to and reason with as you go through that metamorphosis, transition into manhood, that journey.
Yes.
The Jewish tradition, they have a bat mitzvah.
Yes.
And so there's a
Particular
formal
period.
acknowledgement that you are no longer a little boy. So the ways of thinking and the ways of being that were appropriate before that are no longer appropriate going forward. So there is a need to replicate that. And I would encourage single women with families that have boys in particular to try to search out trustworthy, reliable, honest men, whether within their families or outside in the church, to take on that role of mentoring through that I would call it, well, I'm using my experience, that turbulent period.
Yes.
As you're trying to wrestle with who am I and how will that play out? How do I reconcile who I am?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is excellent. In the interest of time, though, I have one last question. We were talking about how you equip your families as shepherds. How has the family, the shepherding concept, or how has family shepherding prepared you for leadership in the church?
I never thought of that carryover and that preparation for leadership in the church. My preparation for leadership happened both at home and at school through the different stages. At high school, I can remember being chosen to be the captain of particular teams, being chosen to be a prefect at school, becoming the deputy head boy of my school. And in many places where I have gone, I've been chosen to play a leadership role. One of the things that I have been learning in the last few years, it's really coming home to me strongly, is that leadership is a role. Some people get a position of leadership and they don't lead very well, but they have a position, a status. I think that leadership is a role rather than a status. And, through the scriptures, not so much through home, but through the scriptures, I've been influenced by the example of Jesus. We condense it and say servant leader. And I think that Jesus said things to his first disciples that have come down to us. The leaders of the Gentiles act like lords and bosses and that kind of thing. But I am here as your servant. And I think two aspects. One is accepting responsibility, and two, to carry it on with the right attitude of humility and service, and recognize that you are not perfect. You can make mistakes, and you have to be humble enough. When somebody says to you ABC, you say okay. And that's something that I'm still learning to accept negative criticism. I say it openly. Now I can say it. 5 years ago, I might not be as forthright in saying it, but I'm saying it for myself. I'm saying it for the persons in this church.
But you made a comment earlier, come to you the same question. The Bible does talk about qualifications for leaders. And one of the qualifications is that he manages his home well. And
Yeah.
so there is a sense in which the Bible is asking the question, how has your home influenced you, prepared you, equipped you for the church?
Well, in this church, for instance, I'm not sure that we have the opportunities to be flies on the wall. So when I was called to be an elder here, I'm not sure that the elders knew how I lived inside within the walls.
But they knew.
They saw the children, they saw my wife, and so on.
The thing about it is, when it's time to compliment, we are silent. If there was something negative, you would not have been invited.
That's true, and that's West Indian. That's not Christian.
All right, let's hear others.
I've enjoyed this discussion. My journey has been a little different. So, not different in substance, but just I have a few names: Oliver Mayer, Christopher Gertig, Bill Hunter, Mr. Grant, George Webster. I would say, this gentleman over here, who shall remain nameless. I have been blessed with very good examples of leadership, and also complemented with the fact that the examples also were good men of the house, husbands, if you follow the list. And so for me, there's no distinction. In my experience, there is no distinction. So I can't say that it's from an example perspective, I've ever perceived there being a good leader and a good husband. They are one and the same. Having said that, I think that certainly in my own experience as a father, as a husband, has concretized what it means to be a servant leader in the public, because your family knows you. It's very easy to dress up on a Sunday morning, put on the right clothes, and to quote a few verses. That's the easy stuff. You learn that, I think, in my experience, I learned that after about a year and a half of coming to church consistently. I did not know the verses for a long time because I didn't go to Sunday school from growing up to teenage. So that took me a longer time still. But that comes. What takes longer is the state of your heart. And your family really tests the state of your heart.
Yes.
And I think to the extent that they have done a good job is the extent to which the church and those that have been fortunate enough to be called to provide leadership in whatever way, then I think I've been better for it.
Yeah.
Is how I'd respond.
Gentlemen, I want to thank both of you on behalf of the congregation, both here on site and those online, for the way you handle yourself this morning. You represented your homes well. And at the same time, I believe this church has benefited from your contributions. This entire month, as you would know, has been focused on the family month, beginning with in the pulpit with a message on singleness, then going on to marriage, then on to parenting. And this morning's discussion, I have never heard on a Sunday morning in more than 50 years of ministry. And so I'm very thankful that we can facilitate something like this. It is no less than a message from the Lord. So we may not ask for an altar call, come to know the Lord Jesus as a result, but I have reason to believe that the word will not return to God void. I believe people have heard. I believe it has registered in the specific areas. And the area that I know for myself and us is to continue to integrate the message of the church with the message of the home. There must not be two messages. I close with this one. Our third child did not share a testimony this morning. But I still remember when I preached at a church in Spanish Town many, many years. As a matter of fact, it was the weekend of Gilbert. And I asked for persons to respond to the message. A few persons raised their hands, and I responded to them. When we got in the car and we were on our way back to Kingston, our last child said, "Daddy, again, I see children do not matter." So I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I raised my hand to give my life to Jesus, and you ignored me." That was hard. So I said to her, as soon as we get home, Mommy would have the privilege to lead you to the Lord. And so I allowed Lorna to be that counselor. And God has used her in that role to counsel 2 of our children to the Lord Jesus. And I think we need to continue the conversation of conversion, sanctification, deeper life issues that are raised in the church, in the home. In addition to that, I'd throw out, which did not come up this morning, what happens at our dining tables as we invite friends to our home, and what our children learn from those who come, and the kind of discussion that takes place. It is there very often career seeds are planted as they listen to others share their stories. And I thank God for every person that has come to our home, whether it be missionary, pastor, new convert, whoever. We have all shared the meal. We have all participated. And I thank God for that. And I trust this morning that the experience on a whole was rich for everyone as we looked at this very important topic of shepherding in the family.